Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Candice. Today we are talking about pornography. And I know this is a heavy-hitting topic. This is something that I find has become way more prevalent amongst Christians in different shapes and forms over the years. And it's something that I think a lot of Christians are struggling with in various forms and shapes and not really talking about, right? A lot of Christians, both men and women, and even teenagers and kids these days, are struggling with these things, and I think it's something that it needs to be talked about. So we're going to go into, the prevalence of it, the pathway that leads to it, how to avoid these things, stuff like that in this video. But of course, first, we're going to pray before we dive right in. God, thank you so much for giving us your word and your wisdom, and for giving us a healthy view and a healthy blueprint for what our lives should look like and how we should be unspotted from the world, and what, a healthy marriage should look like, and for helping us get to the point where we are healthy enough to enter into such an arrangement. Thank you for pointing out the evils in the world and giving us a way out. You always make a way out from temptation for us, Papa. Thank you so much for every single person who's watching this video right now. I know you led them here, and I pray that you would bless them with some sort of information maybe that they haven't heard or that they haven't thought about, and that will change their perception or will help them help somebody who is struggling with these things. I ask that this video would be yours and the words coming out of my mouth would be yours. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name. Okay. So, pornography is huge this day and age, okay? 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if you wanted to view pornography or things of a pornographic nature, right, you had to go and search them out, right? You had to go find a store that sells CD magazines and purchase one, or you had to, go to a place where people were dressed in those sorts of ways, and it was usually only at nighttime, and, you had to go search these things out, right? Today, just about everybody has a laptop, just about everybody has a cell phone, and just about everybody has access to the internet, which means all of the things that people used to have to search out are now available at the click of a button, at the swipe of a finger, and they're just more prevalent, right? They're easier to access. And this is why, of course, these things have gained so much popularity. It starts along the path when we're young, right? Nobody just goes out of nowhere and jumps into, I'm gonna go search for some porn today, right? Nobody just does that out of nowhere. It starts, the seeds that are planted that make us tempted to go and do these things and go search these things out start when we're young, right? If Satan can harm us at all, he tries to do it as young as he can to get his grips in there, right? And kids are being exposed to a lot of things these days. I mean, there are books in your kids' public school libraries that have sexually explicit content in them made for children. There are shows, kids shows, where the girls or the boys in the show are half-dressed. I'm looking at you, Jasmine, Ariel, princess movies, There are shows, movies, books, all of these things that kids are having access to, which start the brain thinking about these things, right? And after they're exposed to these things, of course, it starts running in your brain more, and they start thinking about these things, which turns into lust and temptation and searching these things out. But Satan starts when we're young, right? He starts with, exposure to messages and movies that seem kind of innocent but really aren't, or the kids' movies that have adult jokes in them. You know what I'm talking about? Sexual innuendos and things that are made for the adults in the movie theater, and yet the kids are being exposed to it right there with them. things where it's like cartoon movies for kids where butts are showing and, characters are wearing G-strings and, all of these sorts of things that are supposed to be funny but are really just imparting dangerous messages to children. And even adults, okay, right? Even if you weren't exposed to these things as a child, as an adult or a teenager or an adult, with access to the internet, with access to television, with access to movies, these things are just about everywhere. I mean, any television show you put on these days, except a very few minority shows, right? But most of the shows you put on these days have some sort of nudity in them, have sexual tension, have actual sex scenes in them that show just about everything these days, right? These are all just gateways into actually looking up pornography. In James, the book of James in the Bible, chapter 1, verse 13 through 15. You can read along with me if you like. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Okay? We know, because of the Bible, that fornication, sexual sin, is a sin. It's a problem, right? God is not okay with that. God expected sexuality to be confined within marriage, where two are becoming one. It's a healthy environment. They have no one else to compare each other to. It's just two becoming one intimately, right? That's what God made it to be. But through all of this exposure to all of these things, and that's what James is saying here. James is saying when he is drawn away, right? So when you are exposed to these things, number one on the list of how to get into pornography, how pornography happens, is you're exposed to these images. You're exposed to women at the beach wearing G-strings in front of children. You're exposed to men randomly jogging around your neighborhood in short shorts with no shirts on. You're exposed to images on television, images in movies. You're exposed to ads on the internet for underwear that just happen to have, some model, again, who's only dressed in underwear show up on while you're trying to check your email. We're exposed to these things in books. How many books, on the shelves, for those of you who are big readers, how many books have all of these gratuitous sex scenes and things like that in them? We're exposed to this stuff so much. I mean, people being halfway dressed as in magazines. It's in the ads that they run on the screen while you're pumping your gas. Like, this stuff is everywhere, right? And we're exposed to it at just about every turn. That exposure then leads to number 2, when he's drawn away of his own lust. So that exposure leads to lust, right? Because then these images are in your brain. These scenarios are in your brain. You start thinking about them, right? When you start thinking about them, then of course you start lusting after these things because it awakens these desires within you, right? In Song of Solomon, it says, again and again, it says, do not awaken or stir up love before it's time. God specifically gives us these warnings, right? He says, don't awaken love, don't stir it up before it's time, right? Before you're actually married to someone. Because if you stir it up, if you look at these images, if you start thinking about these images, if you start lusting after these things, you're awakening these feelings in your body, right? And these feelings, no matter if you're a teenager or you're an adult or you're a kid, these feelings then, of course, get connected to, dopamine and oxytocin and all the good feeling centers in your brain. And once you get some, you want more. That's the way God made those things. He knew those things were connected to, all of the good pleasure centers up in our brains. And he made that specifically to be a good thing within marriage, right? for the husband and wife to be able to connect intimately and bond with each other. That's why he made those things, right? Satan, of course, has perverted it and is like, here, let's have you wake up to all of these sensations way early, so then you are way more tempted to do all of these things, right? We're exposed. You start feeling lust, experiencing lusty thoughts, right? And then you're tempted. That's number 3. You're tempted to search out more of these images. You're tempted to watch more movies that have more questionable scenes in them. You're tempted to read more books that have questionable things in them, right? And that temptation, of course, if it happens over and over and over and over again, can very easily go from just being temptation to actually being sin, right? Where you are looking up pornography, or you are going out and fornicating with somebody, or you're going really close to towing the line with somebody, but trying not to go all the way over, but getting yourself into scenarios that aren't good for you, right? These are the things that are so prevalent today, especially even amongst Christians. I have known a lot of Christians who have struggled with pornography, who have struggled with fornication, who have struggled with, lusty thoughts towards the opposite sex, who have struggled with seeing these images in magazines, in movies, in books, whatever it may be. And it's something that I think just a lot of people aren't really talking about. Or if we talk about pornography, it's talking about men who are addicted to pornography, right? I'm here to tell you, women can be just as tempted by the same things, especially if for the women who are visual, right? Women can be just as tempted. Women are even more so tempted by things like romance novels, because those spin an emotional scenario around sex, right? Instead of just having images of people who don't really know each other. These things are infecting all of us as Christians or not Christians, but it's really digging its heels into the Christian community. I mean, how many people do we know that have teenagers that are addicted to porn or addicted to their phones and have unfettered access to the internet, and so are just one click away from looking at these things and finding these things, right? This is why so many Christian teenagers even are having sex. They say something like I know when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, okay, the average, they said that somebody has their first sexual encounter was like 13 years old. 13. That should be appalling, right? At 13, you're still a baby. Come on, you don't know all of the things you need to know. Your body hasn't even fully matured yet. Like, you haven't grown into yourself and your own ideas of who you are. Like, and I know since then that number has probably gotten lower, right? It's because we're so exposed to these things. I was exposed to pornography, legitimate pornography, before I was 3 years old. How many of you have been exposed? How young were you when you were first exposed? That exposure leads to the sin eventually. It's where do we stop it, right? Like I said, there are so many teenagers that are falling into sexual sin, and not just pornography, but then the pornography leading to them actually taking sexual partners, right? And then that leads, of course, to STDs, unwanted pregnancies. We know all of this. But Satan does this, and he goes after us as young as he can possibly get us, right? To desensitize us to it. To make it seem like it's no big deal. To have us not have open eyes to how wrong it is, right? To make it seem like it's normal and okay and even a positive thing. Satan will spin it as a positive thing. I mean, how many TV shows have you seen where they spin casual sex to make it seem like it's a positive, healthy thing to do to satisfy your urges? Go have as many partners as you want. And yet, if you actually look at the statistics, the more sexual partners you have before you get married, the more likely you are to get divorced. The more of yourself you've given away before you get married, the more likely you are to get divorced. If you live with someone before you get married, a romantic partner, you are more likely to get divorced, right? So Satan tries to take all of these things that he knows are going to lead to destruction, a destruction of a marriage, a destruction of a relationship, a destruction of trust. Heck, watching porn and doing all that leads to affairs. Like, it's just stepping stones along further and further to more sin. And so he knows that it leads to destruction, right? It says in James, and when it's finished, it brings forth death. That might be the death of a relationship, the death of a marriage, whatever it is, right? So he wants to get us as far along this line before we get to marriage. That way the chances of marriage succeeding plummet. That's his end goal. His end goal is to do that. So how do we avoid these things? How do we protect our children, right? How do we nix the exposure and the lust and the temptation and the sin, right? Well, obviously along this spectrum, we start with number one, the exposure. Especially for kids, right? I would argue, you might call me extreme, I would argue that kids do not need exposure to most technology at all when they're children. If you watch all of these kids' shows, they are promoting rebellion against parents, they're promoting early sexuality, they're promoting all of these sorts of things that are problematic. And if you actually watch these shows to see what the message is behind them, a lot of those messages, again, will start you on that path. So I would argue that most kids should not have access to television, should not have access to a phone with internet access, should not have access to the internet on a laptop. And you can say, okay, well, there's parental controls, there's this and this and that. I'm sorry, most kids by the time they're 12 know how to get around those things. I would argue, again, no exposure to these things in that sort of realm, in the realms that you can control. You can't exactly control what they see on the shelf at the grocery store, right? You can't exactly control what they see when you're at a public beach, right? But you can control, as a parent especially, you can control what they see when they're in your home. You can control what books they're reading. You can control whether or not they're seeing TV. You can control if they have a phone or not. You can control those sorts of things. And I would say that to get rid of that exposure and keep them from it as long as humanly possible, right? Also along those lines is not exposing them to immodesty within the home. So again, 100 years ago, showing your ankles or your kneecaps would have been considered a scandal and risque. Now people go to the beach in G-strings and nobody bats an eyelash, right? Even within our own homes, a lot of the times parents or just random people visiting the home will be walking around in things that are less than modest. The more modest you are, the less they're exposed, right? And especially when the kids are young, because when they're young, they're like shorter in stature, and so they are closer to where their eyes meet up is usually around your bits, right? And especially for women, it's around your bits. Even for guys, if you've got like 2 or 3 year olds, their eyeballs are like at crotch level. So making sure things are modest helps keep them from the exposure to it, right? With the lust, right? Keeping them away, like I said, television, they might be seeing girls or boys at school that are dressed immodestly, or going to friends' houses where friends are exposing them to these things, or friends have gone farther down the rabbit hole and are showing them these things. I would be very careful of, what friends they have. Make sure you know them, know their parents, right? Again, with the television, if you are able to, homeschooling can help keep a lot of these things out of the equation. And when it comes to the temptations, right? Watching what messages your family is exposed to. So if you're watching a show, or you go see a play, or you're reading a book, right? And the underlying message, whatever that underlying message is, if it's negative or ungodly, to avoid it, right? A lot of shows, the underlying message is that casual sex is okay, or that having a bunch of sexual partners is not going to hurt you, it's going to get you up the corporate ladder, amongst other things, right? And of course, when it comes to the actual sin of fornication, keeping them away from things, not letting your kids, see you and your husband getting it on, or other people getting it on. You know what I mean? Locks on doors, stuff like that. When it comes to adults, of course, if you're an adult struggling with these things, these tips go for you too. I mean, there are a lot of adults who struggle with addiction to pornography. I've known quite a few, right? The biggest thing, of course, is to cut off the exposure. So if it's images of, half-naked women in the grocery aisle that are really prompting that lust, which turns into the temptation, starting back with the exposure. If that is something that triggers you, make sure you're not looking, right? Or avoid that grocery store that has them in that aisle. If it's, seeing women or men at the beach who are scantily clad, that really triggers you, don't go to that beach. Maybe have a pool in your backyard, or go somewhere else, right? Trying to avoid the exposure, keep yourself away from the internet or anything that is triggering on the internet, right? Don't watch shows that are PG-13 and above, that have, things in them that ought not to be. Now, of course, when we are attempting to avoid these things, it is easy to fall back into temptation. I'm going to tell you something right now. God is an amazing Redeemer. He has so much grace for us and so much love. He extends that grace over and over again, right? If you fall into temptation, if this is something that you are struggling with, repenting of it to God, confessing it to God, because usually this is the kind of sin that nobody wants to talk about, nobody wants to confess and say, hey, I'm dealing with this, but you can talk to God about it. He's not going to tell anybody, right? Confessing it to God, repenting of it, asking God for strength to get that sort of thing out of your life, and then dwelling in God's grace and God's love, right? He will take these things, He will redeem you, He will get this out of your life, right? Of course, it's going to take some work on your own part, like I said, avoiding the exposure. But God can redeem anything, right? Even if it's somebody that that is struggling with this, and it's not you, say it's your teenager that you think is struggling with something like this, confessing and repenting of the fact that you allowed your teenager to be exposed to these things growing up, or that these things somehow entered your home and you didn't realize the effect that they would have on a teenage boy, or things like that, and then asking God for help, right? And if you are a parent and you have a teenager or a child who's struggling with this, it's your responsibility to take away the cell phone, right? It's your responsibility to take away the internet access and to do the best by your kids while you still can, right? Before it's so ingrained that they struggle with it for a long time into the future. I think that's about all we're going to talk about with this today, guys, but I'm going to leave you with this. God, there is hope. There's hope. God redeems and restores. God can nick pornography addiction in the butt. Like, He can completely take it from your life, completely take the temptations and all of it and redeem you, right? If you've gone so far as to have sexual encounters with a lot of people before you're married, God can redeem you and bring you back, right? There might still be consequences of your actions, but God will redeem you and restore you. And He is forgiving and loving, and He loves you always. I hope this has blessed you in some way, and I'll see you guys next time.